So welcome. My name is Steve Call. I'm the president of the New America Foundation. And with me are two of the preeminent foreign policy thinkers in the country, both of whom happen to be members of our board of directors. So we are delighted doubly to have them here. On the far side, Anne Marie Slaughter, who's the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. And in the center, of course, Fareed Zakaria, the editor of Newsweek International and a writer on many subjects. Just to make clear what you should think about for the holiday season. This is Anne Marie's latest book, The Idea That Is America, which is a very powerful and very readable synthesis of her work on foreign policy that I think is particularly useful, as is Fareed's, as a sort of primer for what you're going to be reading about in the newspapers for the next 4 years. And of course, Fareed's book, a New York Times bestseller, The Post-American World, which is still only available in hardcover. But that makes for a more solid present under the Fareed. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. Obviously a good time to remember to flip off your ringers and phones and buzzers and beepers. If you haven't, everyone I think is taken care of with lunch. At some stage, folks will come by and relieve you of your plates if you still have them. So just watch for that. It's 12:15, and we've advertised your departure at 1:30, but I think this is going to be a rich conversation, and I'm sure that while some of you may need to get up and go at 1:30, we will have a soft close, as it were, and we'll see where we are and take some questions, and if we still have questions running, we'll go a little beyond that if Fareed and Anne-Marie's schedules permit. I wanted to just recognize a couple of people who have been very important to New America besides the two who are up here. In the front row is Rita Hauser, who is the chairman of the advisory council for our foreign policy shop, which is run by Steve Clemens, a terrific synthesizer and thinker based in Washington, who many of you know. Unfortunately, he has a stomach bug and wasn't able to ride the train up today. But I want to, on his behalf, thank Rita for her support and intellectual leadership in New America. And also mention one other Christmas gift, which is a book that New America brought out this year, called America and the World, which Steve Clemens put together as a conversation between Zbigniew Brzezinski and Brent Scowcroft. A really surprisingly powerful discourse moderated by David Ignatius, kind of unexpected in lots of ways. And with these two books, I think all very digestible, very powerful, and easy to read, and as I say, ideal for the holiday season. So we'll talk up here for a little while, probably 45 minutes or so. And when the time comes, I'll turn to you for questions, and we'll continue with the conversation there. Bear in mind that we are on the record, and more than that, on video. So don't say anything you don't want your nephews in university to hear you say. And please identify yourself when you do speak. So I guess I just start with an obvious question at the sort of 30,000-foot level. And you've both been talking about this over the last 6 weeks, so to some extent I just would like you to start by digesting your thinking for this audience about strategy and the Obama administration. We spend a lot of time in the newspapers and on television talking about personalities and transition processes and winners and losers on the inside, but in the end, I think the electorate, without being able to fully articulate it, has an expectation that this president will change American foreign policy and change the strategy by which America engages with the rest of the world. And you both laid out frameworks for that change. Could you just describe them and also connect them to the economic crisis? Because you both often observe that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And what are the particular opportunities that this crisis presents for the strategic thinking that you've been doing? And Anne-Marie, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think to start with the economic crisis, one of the least noticed things that has happened in the last 6 weeks is that effectively the G8 has been replaced by the G20. There have been countless books, articles, recommendations about how to expand the G8 to make it the G13, to make it the G16, to make it the 15. The fact is, it is now the G20, which it was a group of finance ministers founded after the East Asian financial crisis, and now has met at the first time at leaders level. What's important for Americans is that because it was founded after the East Asian financial crisis, it includes Korea and Australia and Indonesia. Certainly Korea and Australia might not be included otherwise, but it has now met as the leaders level group that was going to effectively think of a new Bretton Woods, and it will meet again in April. That effectively means we now have a group that is much more representative than the West and the rest, as Fareed calls it. That is important because one of the key things that Obama has to do is to say we are still leading, but we are now leading in a broader world and a more representative set of institutions. The IMF will get reformed, the World Bank will get reformed, but independent of the specific reforms, we are now operating with key countries around the world to solve lots of global problems. And one of the things that Obama is going to really change is the way America thinks of who the key players in the world are. His own background, his time in Indonesia, his sense that you have to lead in a more team-based way means that he will work with these countries, and there are all sorts of new opportunities, also new challenges working with these countries.
And Fareed, as to the broader goals and then as to the institution, what should the scope of the G20's role become, do you think? Should it, like the G7, become a quasi-political institution as well as just an economic one, or should it just be used to deal with these financial architecture questions and achieve the G20-like goals in other institutions?
You know, I agree with Anne-Marie with everything she said. This is going to happen a lot. But I would actually say, I would go further and say, this is the expanded Security Council we've been trying to create for a long time, you know, and it's never going to happen because it is impossible for the privileged group within the Security Council to ever expand themselves. But what are we trying to do here? At the broadest level is we're trying to come up with coordinated policies at an institutional, practical level so that you have the buy-in of all these other countries in the world. You have the legitimacy that provides. You have the ability for East to talk to West, North to talk to South, however you want it. Well, you have all of that in the G20. What I would do is turn the G20 into something better than the G8. Have it meet on a regular basis. Give it a bureaucracy so that as an institutional matter, it can start identifying the kinds of issues that can only be addressed by coordinated action among the leading countries of the world. Because the crisis that we really face right now, far more than of capitalism or American power, the great crisis is of globalization. Globalization is producing lots of problems that are transnational in nature, from terrorism to climate change to energy use, but the response, political power, remains very tightly controlled at the national level. So you have problems that are international in scope, political power, that is the solutions, the potential solutions, all at a national level. How do you bridge this? You can't do it through the UN Security Council. You can't. So this is a very useful mechanism going forward to try, and solve some of these problems. I think that over time, if we do it right, everything else gets coordinated through them. You know, it's not that you completely marginalize the UN or you marginalize any other groups, but they all feed in through this one more representative body. It has the advantage of being small enough that it's possible to imagine it having some substance rather than 193 countries. But large enough that none of the major stakeholders feel excluded. You know, the problem you've had with all expansion so far is that if you include one or two developing countries, the others feel excluded. This one is broad enough that it actually finesses most of those problems. So I think it's a good step forward, and it's interesting. It happened, as Anne-Marie said, sort of by accident and in crisis. But of course, that's how many of the institutions of the 1950s and 40s were created.
And so, if it were seized properly, Anne-Marie, what do you think it's realistic to set as success in 4 years? What would success in the evolution of the G20 as a mechanism for these goals look like in that time frame?
Well, so the first thing to say, it's not an end in itself, right? I mean, just rearranging who sits at the table is a tool, but it's not an end in itself. Let me just say, I disagree with Fareed about the UN Security Council. I actually think we will see some kind of reform, but I do agree that the creation of the G20, I think, is going to make that easier.
I'll take a bet.
I'm happy to take the bet. I'm happy to take the bet. 8 years from now.
All right, so what is your, in order for me to arbitrate this bet, I need to know what it is you're predicting will happen.
I would say within 8 years, you'll have either Plan A or Plan B of the high-level panel. That means either you'll have Germany, Japan, Brazil, India, 2 African countries as non-veto wielding permanent members, or you'll have a complicated rotational system that will essentially achieve the same thing, that India and Japan and Germany and Brazil and 2 African countries will always be.
The veto will not expand.
The veto will not expand, no question. And which of those I'm not certain, but I think there are lots of reasons. But come back to your fundamental question. The issue here is going to be how well you can use the G20 to shore up institutions to regulate capitalism in ways that cushion some of these problems of globalization and harmonize regulatory policies so that they're not so intrusive as a response to the crisis. Climate change, having other countries assume more of our defense burden, certainly in Afghanistan and also in whatever's going to follow in Iraq as we pull out. In all of those areas, the Obama administration is going to be urging other countries to take more of the lead and to do more. And we're going to be willing to let other countries take more of the lead in specific areas. There's some things we have to do, like non-proliferation, obviously like driving the policy in Iraq and other places in the Middle East. But there are lots of places where, take for instance, Turkey pushing Syria and Israel or facilitating Syria and Israel's negotiations. Indonesia running a forum of democracies and promoting democracy in Asia. Japan trying to take the lead with China on climate change policy, and Japan, Korea, and China all meeting as a trilateral. Traditionally, the U.S. would have been, if we're not there, it shouldn't happen, or it should only happen without us if we directed it. I think Obama is going to be pushing other countries to step up, but he'll want to make sure that we're still coordinating in a fundamental way. And the G20, to come back to your specific question, I'd say in 8 years, if the G20 proved a forum whereby we could create smaller groups, we could encourage different countries within the G8 to take the lead in specific areas in an informal way, but an effective way, it would be a much more effective instrument for working out global problems than the G7 or any of our current institutions.
Let me just ask one variation on that theme, and then you can add in. What, from the point of view of an American nationalist, would success through the G20 and like-minded reforms look like? In other words, Anne-Marie hinted that America would play a coordinating role, but she also described an evolution in which inevitably direct American control is going to ebb. And so in thinking about American interests and a strategy of orchestration, what are the goals that you would have firmly in mind as you reach particular intersections along the way?
At the very abstract level, it's easy to say. What you're trying to do is to create a stable, liberal, open world system that does not require that the United States be the atlas of that world, that it does not bear the entire burden of it, partly because you are getting the creation of new powers anyway, and the question is, are they going to buy into this, or are they going to start freelancing and create fissiparous tendencies? Partly because you want it to be more stable and more legitimate, and that becomes more and more difficult if it is just the United States. Specifically, I would say, to answer your original question, success would mean in the next 3 or 4 years, you would see some significant measure of international financial and regulatory coordination. If you don't get that, in my opinion, you are just setting yourself up for the next great financial crisis, because the one thing that has truly been globalized in this world is capital. You know, I mean, you saw it in that initial period after the crisis in America, where every country decided it was going to adopt a purely national policy. and you had complete chaos. You had the government of Britain arguing with the government of Ireland over who got the bank deposits, because Ireland had guaranteed them in a certain way and Britain had not. This is the classic problem. I mean, in its purest form, because nothing is more globalized than capital. You hit a keystroke and it goes. There's no friction in the system. So you have to try and stabilize that. And for an American nationalist, I would say, for an American, the most important part of this is what was going to be the most important goal for President Obama, which is the restoration and repair of American power, which I think begins with the stabilization of the financial system and the rescue of American capitalism. I mean, I think far and away this is the dominant goal that is going to be front and center for the Obama administration in its first term, assuming it has two. You're going to have to inject confidence into the system, and how you do that is an interesting question. It's not just, I think, being confident. Bush is plenty confident. But it seems that confidence utterly disconnected with any reality and therefore comes across as weird. I think he's going to have to create a much greater sense of stability and predictability. I think the way in which the markets have been handled by Paulson and Bernanke has been episodic, ad hoc, and at a time, Dave Swenson said this to me, and he runs Yale's endowment and is a super smart guy. He said, the crucial issue in moments of financial crisis is you want to create predictability and certainty. And what the administration has done is create unpredictability and uncertainty. You never know whether a bank is going to be bailed out, and if it is, on what terms, and what will the guarantees look like. And the third thing, I think, is the ability to create a kind of reform Keynesianism, if you will. A reform Keynesianism, by which I mean a rescue of capitalism, but one that does not get you back into all the old problems of large-scale government intervention and regulation, which is that they get captured by special interests, they get captured by industry, they get captured by corrupt. Is there a way to get to a not big government or small government, but smart government idea? And New America has done a lot of good work on this. But I think that's going to be the absolutely crucial goal of the Obama administration, and the G20 will only work if it can succeed in that process, in the rescue, as it were, of international capitalism.
So let's discuss this. Let's connect this discussion to the actual transition that we see underway. Do you, if I were playing the devil's advocate, I'd say let's look at the foreign policy and national security appointments so far. They are perhaps of a different character. Certainly at the National Security Council, you have a Marine general, very thoughtful, creative, interesting character, but certainly not as someone who's been working on these kinds of strategies or on the economic, the way globalization connects to economic and political reform. So what is your evaluation, in short, of why do you believe that this will in fact be the priority of the Obama administration's foreign policy, and what is the evidence that you see so far about how this will be executed? Or do you think it's too early to judge?
I knew you were going to let me go first on that. So I actually think there is a way in which it could be deeply reflective of a new agenda, but we just don't know. The way President-elect Obama sees it is he's going to be driving that agenda. And if that's true, then what he's done, it has been to make appointments that guarantee he's got every constituency linked to. So he's got the military with his national security advisor. He has Hillary's supporters and women's groups and others because of the choice of Hillary. He's got various, when you look at his deputies, he's going to have the sort of think tank community, the Washington community. He's reached out on the economic side. Everyone effectively is part of the team. So if you think that his mission is to sell a new direction, it's a set of very good appointments, but it's been politically driven in terms of making sure every constituency is represented. If you think, and this is why I say you just don't know, that no matter how talented he is and how able he is to create a team, the realities of Washington politics are going to take over, and you have lots of strong egos, and the president's attention is necessarily limited, and those people are going to have to be are going to be wanting to chart their own course, then we need still some new elements, I think, added into the team. People who are going to do business not as usual. But I think we don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what the message I get from what's been done so far is that Obama wants a stable, safe set of hands on foreign policy so that he can concentrate his attentions on the economy. I may be wrong, but it does seem to be moving in that direction. I think one would have to be honest and say there isn't a kind of grand strategist in the foreign policy team right now. Hillary Clinton is an amazingly talented, accomplished woman, but I don't think even her greatest admirers would say that about her. I don't think that's true of Jim Jones, though he's a very, very competent and thoughtful guy. Gates is a smart guy. I think that, but is there a kind of Brzezinski, Kissinger, Dean Acheson type who's thinking about the architecture? It doesn't appear to be, and perhaps that's something that Obama intends to do himself. I mean, I think that we'll have to see. In our audience is Karen Martin. Her husband Richard Holbrooke certainly has that talent, and he may be used in some form. There are other people, but so far you'd have to say that it does seem as though it is an approach that suggests the economy is going to be front and center, which is unfortunate because I actually think that these issues all intersect. Right. And by the way, the world won't wait. He has to have a policy on Afghanistan, which is going to be connected to a policy on Pakistan, which is going to be connected to a policy on India, which gets you into the Iran issue, and you can't deal with, you can't push that off and say, I'll deal with that in the second term.
So let's then take that as a way to transition from the luxury of strategy down into the actual world that the president will inherit. And of course, Frieden, I would be tempted to start immediately with South Asia, but I won't. Come back to that. Let's start in the Middle East. And I'm particularly interested in whether or not either of you see there an argument for a need for a new security architecture of some sort, or is that kind of construct the wrong way to address the inheritance? And whether or not you see a role for, say, a new compact that would bring Sunni Arab states together and perhaps have an effect on Iran's thinking about its bargaining. Are there other areas in the world in which you would argue for new kinds of security architecture, and if so, where?
Well, I think in the Middle East you have something really remarkable happening, which is for the first time in living memory, and I think the first time ever, you have the major Sunni Arab states on the same side of the fundamental strategic divide as Israel. They're all worried about Iran as a regional hegemon, as a dominant player in the region. And the Sunni Arab states, if you talk to them, are aware of this, and Israel is aware of it. So you have this strange quasi-alliance, and it's a very strange and very quasi, but it is a meeting of strategic minds. And I think it should be something that is encouraged, enhanced.
Do you want to lock it in formally?
I don't want to do that. I think that the experience of John Foster Dulles and what was then called Pactomania in the 1950s was very instructive. And it is a difference between the Western and the Eastern mind, if you will, in very generic terms. If you think about NATO, NATO is a very clear formal alliance with Article 5 saying, the security of one is security for all. It implies a kind of immediate legal obligation to go to war to defend another. This would never work in Asia, for example. In Asia, everybody is balancing against China while saying that they're the best friends of China. They will never form an alliance against China, but they will always continue to balance against, So it's this very subtle and complex tapestry that you have to orchestrate. The Middle East is exactly like that. First of all, for obvious reasons, Egypt is not going to say it's in an alliance with Israel. But even beyond that, Egypt is not even, I'm not sure would say it's in an alliance with Saudi Arabia. There's tension as to who is the leader of the region and who would get to sit at the table. So I think what would be much better, and the American role becomes indispensable here, is that we orchestrate, to use the word you described, but we try to figure out what is the common strategic objective. How can we push this process forward? And in doing so, resolve the greatest tension in the region. Resolve is a strong word. Soften the greatest tension in the region, which is the distinction, the tension between Israel and the moderate Arab states. So I think there's a great opportunity here, but it's one for a lot of creative diplomacy rather than a new cento or whatever you want to call it.
So, Anne Marie, a sort of conventional wisdom seems to be settling in that as to the practical priorities of the next Secretary of State in the Middle East, and as to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that the first order of business should be to support these somewhat opaque negotiations between Israel and Syria, and that deals between Israel and Syria and taking Lebanon into account as well is a better bet than reviving or intensifying the track to Palestinian state, given the weaknesses politically in both Israel and Palestine. What's your diagnosis about that? And then add into it a statement of intent to how to sequence strategy and negotiations with Iran.
Well, I think the conventional wisdom in Princeton may be different than it is in Washington, because I think the conventional wisdom in Princeton, and this is based on both Dennis Ross and Dan Kurtzer holding panels in the last week, and the first panel, to my knowledge, where the Saudi Prince Turkey sat on the same panel as Ambassador Rabinovich of Israel publicly, with Dan Kurtzer moderating, which was quite something. And I actually think what's most striking about an emerging consensus is that the administration should plunge into Middle East peacemaking now and not wait. The classic argument is, well, you don't want to do it right away because it's very risky and you don't want to spend your capital. But then year 2, they're the midterm elections and you don't want to do it then. And then year 3, you're getting over the midterm elections. And that classically, the president starts to focus between year 3 and year 4, and you've lost a huge amount. Now, as Fareed says, there is an extraordinary strategic moment. There is, I think, a sense that there's a real chance, and not just on Syria, although I agree people may think that's the first thing you do, but I don't think that's what you do instead of plunging back into Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. I think the arguments I've heard is that even if Netanyahu is elected, this moment is too rare to waste, so that you should put a lot of effort, a special envoy, a lot of State Department effort into seeing what you can get. Because if you can, in fact, reach a two-state solution, and the other thing I would say is there's a tremendous amount of worry that the opportunity for a two-state solution is closing, that window is closing, and that if we lose it, we're looking at another generation at least. We can't see peace between Palestine and Israel as we've been able to. If you then imagine success there, which seems unimaginable, but that's, I think, what is being pushed, suddenly then you move on to the architecture in the Middle East as we pull out of Iraq. And that looks quite different if, in fact, you have a settlement between the Sunni Arab states and Israel. And I think, and from there you also look at Iran and you look at Afghanistan, and at the same time you will have some kind of envoy working the other side of the region, right? Working Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Iran, looking from that way and this way. And I actually think that there's a fair chance that in the first 2 years of the next administration, there'll be a big push, and it comes back to, well, why are there no grand ideas? Well, we've got to get ourselves out of Iraq. We've got to come up with a new strategy for Afghanistan, and we have to get the Middle East to a more stable position. If we do that, the world will look very different in terms of grand strategy. Last thing I would just say is I agree with Fareed that this is not the time for CENTO or some kind of formal treaty pact. I do think, though, there are opportunities for more informal organizations, things on water, things on the economy of the region, connections to the EU through the Mediterranean Union. There's a lot of opportunity to create ways of bringing these states into more sustained contact without formal alliance structures. And we need them, because there are very few ways in which the individuals, certainly in Israel, but even in some of the Arab states, interact on a regular basis.
So So, Frida, if I were the president-elect and I asked you how I should define my goals in negotiations with Iran and how I should sequence my approach to attempt to achieve those goals, what would you advise?
Oh boy, I think this is the one that's probably been oversold more than anything else because of Obama's frankly mistake in that debate. He clearly should not have said he would meet with Ahmadinejad. I think you perhaps didn't hear that, but the nature of American politics is you're never allowed to make a mistake, so it was dug in and then you had to explain why it was actually the smartest thing in the world to say. But obviously you should start this at a much lower level. The Iranians are plenty complicated themselves. You see whether they would bite. I don't know that they would. There's a very good chance that you make overtures to Iran and they won't. Madeleine Albright actually did. She apologized for the Mossadegh coup. She, in effect tried to extend her arm to what was then the reformist administration of Khatami, and it went nowhere. The Iranians were meant to attend a meeting recently, with kind of international regional meeting. The last minute they pulled out. It's a very strange country with a very strange set of, shouldn't say strange country, it's a very strange regime with a lot of internal dissension. And so I think what our strategy should be is not to try to, psychoanalyze and kind of therapeutically change it, but to try to figure out if we can have an honest exchange with them about what their goals are, what our goals are, what the potential carrots we have out there, and what the potential sticks out there are. So I think it should be very straightforward to try to find some interlocutor who represents Khamenei, who is the only person who matters, to the extent that you can find one channel, and say, look, we want to explain, this is what we would like to do. These are the offers on the table, and these are what our bright lines are. And we can cooperate on many issues if you see fit. I don't think that there is sort of magic here in terms of with the Iranians, but I do think if you put that out there, it throws the Iranian regime into considerable debate. Right now, what are you seeing? If you look at what's happening in Iran right now, Ahmadinejad is not as popular as he was, though he remains plenty popular, by the way. You have impending presidential elections. He fired Ali Larijani, the national security advisor, who then ran for Speaker of Parliament. This could not happen without Khamenei, the spiritual leader's okay. Larijani wins by 150 votes out of 300, huge majority, landslide. Again, could not have happened without the supreme leader's help. Now Khatami says that maybe he's going to run for president. So you have two potential candidates against Ahmadinejad, one of whom is clearly reformist, the other of whom has familial ties to Khamenei. Larijani comes from a great old spiritual family, clerical family in Iran. So something is going on there. And we don't completely understand it. There was this recent event at a university where a guy stood up and started denouncing Ahmadinejad with Larijani at the podium. It was on, the Wall Street Journal had an editorial about it this morning. I think we should be, fundamentally what I should think we should be doing is creating a containment policy toward Iran, which waits them out. Time is on our side, not on their side. But as with containment of the Soviet Union, we want to have communication, we want to have contact, we want to have negotiation, we want to find areas for mutual cooperation, but we want them to understand that we think time is on our side, not theirs.
Do you think time is on our side?
Absolutely.
But what about the pace of enrichment?
So if they get 3 nuclear bombs, what is it done for North Korea? What has it done for Pakistan? Have these countries suddenly become major world powers as a result? These are basket case countries. Iran's GDP is 1/70th, I think, of the United States. With oil prices at $45 a barrel, they were budgeting at $70 a barrel oil. I think that the 3 countries in the world that are going to be in trouble with oil prices where they are Iran, Venezuela, and Russia, because they're all population-rich countries with real social issues, and they've been using high oil prices to bribe their populations into acceptance. And, by the way, using the surplus cash to throw it around to Hezbollah and even to Hamas. So I think that they have more problems than we think.
You seem less sanguine.
So we finally disagree. Free and I agree on so many things, but on this one, I quite disagree. I agree they're in trouble, economically. From my point of view, that means we should be increasing the carrots that they could get by giving up their nuclear programs now that we have an opportunity actually to offer them things they really need, and we're in a much better position to offer those carrots than we were when the price of oil was so high. But from the point of view of letting them get those weapons, I really disagree for several reasons. One, we will then lose all the leverage that we have with the Sunni Arab states. We have that leverage with the Sunni Arab states because they are terrified that if Iran goes nuclear, they will then be able to further disrupt the politics of the region behind a nuclear shield.
Just balance of power politics will tell you the greater the threat, the greater the incentive for them to be allied to you.
No,
the fact that the Soviet Union have nuclear weapons make Western Europe less interested in an American alliance or more interested.
It made both Great Britain and France get nuclear weapons of their own, and the French were not about to rely on us, and that's exactly what will happen in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia will get.
Saudi Arabia can build a nuclear weapon. You have not been to Saudi Arabia.
I think they can buy a nuclear weapon, but I think it's crazy. There's a tipping point. You don't want to go down that road.
I'm not saying
you don't want to say Iran can get a nuclear weapon, North Korea can get a nuclear weapon, North Korea gets a nuclear weapon.
I just don't believe that. I mean, I think we're not as far apart. What I'm saying is the self-made crisis and paranoia that we have, 1 year to solve Iran gives the Iranians enormous advantages. And I think if we take the approach that at the end of the day you're a two-bit country with a dysfunctional economy and a regime with legitimacy problems, and we are the United States of America coupled with the EU, we have 70% of global GDP, almost, and if we can get Russia in on this, all the world's nuclear weapons, it's a very different picture.
There's a fundamental question that runs through the Oval Office that I think you've implied your answer to, but you can state it, and then, Anne-Marie, I'm not sure where you are, which is, do you think that military action could delay Iran's acquisition of a full fuel cycle or weaponization capability? And if you think it might, would you consider trying to postpone the day, or do you think that is a fool's mission?
No, I think it's a fool's mission. I would not argue for a military action. I'm not sure that I would take it off the table. That's a bargaining point, not a real point. But I don't.
But you can't have it both ways. You can't paint an apocalypse if it's going to happen and then say
not
we
true.
wouldn't.
That's not true. This is a question of what's the best bargaining strategy. What's the most likely way to get them to give up their nuclear weapons? And from my point of view, and I think where we agree, is that the best way you give them to get them to give up their nuclear weapons is to change the domestic political configuration. You and I agree there that in the end it's a troubled regime. What you want to do is weaken the hardliners and let the normal process go to the point where you have some liberalization and or an understanding that you're going to get more by giving up these weapons than taking them. So the point is, what's the best way to get that? And my point was only, I agree with you that you shouldn't be paranoid, but I wouldn't basically act as if, at least in real terms, not what you're showing them, but in real terms, as if time is on our side. I think it's a problem you have to work, and you have to work actively diplomatically, because I think it would be fairly disastrous.
Let me give you what I think is a potential solution, because let's be honest, we actually don't know that Iran wants nuclear weapons. They have continually said that they don't. They say it repeatedly in ways that I always think it's worth listening to what people say. They keep saying that it would be immoral. Ayatollah Khomeini has said that they are immoral. It is quite conceivable that what they want is a breakout capacity. That is, that they create a very sophisticated civilian program that could easily be weaponized. They create very sophisticated missiles, but they don't link the two, because that would really put them into a kind of pariah status. And I think they are aware that even the Russians and the Chinese that would be a kind of bright line. So is it possible for us to permanently keep them under that trigger point? Possibly, and one solution might be a kind of permanent international inspections regime in Iran. In other words, that they get to enrich, that they get to own the fuel cycle, because I do believe it's going to be very hard to dissuade them of that. But they have on two or three occasions hinted that they might be willing to accept permanent IAEA inspections. So it would be in effect a kind of, they're in a box. Could they cheat? Yeah, it's possible that they could cheat, but it's quite hard.
Well, our colleague Jeffrey Lewis has argued for something similar and argued that you could use that as the basis for extending the additional protocols and toughening the
Precisely,
global
I've read
inspection
that, yeah.
regime, and I think that's certainly one plausible approach. Well, let's turn to the next door neighbors. When Fareed, you and I were in a conversation recently where Nick Burns was present, and he said that he made the observation that the Obama presidency will be the first in American history where the president will come into office knowing that South Asia is of equal strategic importance to the United States as the Middle East. That was true of the Bush administration, just didn't know it. So what then is that we know that this is the site, as the Middle East is, of one of the two inherited wars, that Afghanistan is the war going in the wrong direction, that a new strategy will be formed, and we can come back to some of that granular material later. But thinking about that more broadly, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, at a moment both of economic crisis that threatens to disrupt the paradigm of India's uninhibited march to civilizational and economic greatness, and also at a time when Pakistan seems to be descending yet further into instability. What is your framework for the first 2 to 3 years, now that you are at least aware?
Foreign policy quiz when he was running for president, and I think it asked him 3 questions, and 2 of them were about South Asia. One was, what is the name of the president of Pakistan?
Pakistan.
And he said it's some general, I can't remember his name. The second was, what is the Taliban? And I think he said, is it a rock band or something like that. So it's interesting that radio station guy knew what you just described, that South Asia was crucial. I think the biggest problem we face 2 separate problems, I would say, at a very broad level. The one is the war in Afghanistan specifically. And by that I mean, let me put it, the best metaphor I can think of is an actual event that took place. In 2006, there was an American engagement with the enemy in one of these valleys in the area between Pakistan and Afghanistan, And they did an after-action report. And the American army asked these people, why was it so much more intense, longer duration than we thought it would be? And so they interview all the participants, people who were there. And these 18 to 20-year-old Afghan kids are debriefed, and they ask them, why did you fight? And they say, well, this is the most exciting thing that's happened in our valley in 15 years. And we can't stand by as bystanders. I mean, we would be dishonored in our communities as young, virile men if we were to not take part in this fight. We had to fight. And so they said, then why did you fight on the side of the Taliban? They said, well, we couldn't fight on the side of the Americans, right? So what do you expect us to do? So they say, well, do you agree with the Taliban? Do you want the return of the caliphate? And they say, no. We had to take part in this fight. We couldn't not, and we can't fight on the side of the foreigners. That's it. David Kilcullen tells this story in a book that which I've had galleys off, which is called The Accidental Insurgent. And I think the fundamental question we've got to ask in Afghanistan is, are we creating accidental insurgents? Or to put it another way, if we didn't go into those valleys, what would happen? If we would actually just say to ourselves, this is not, we don't like the Taliban, but many of these people have absolutely no global jihadist ambitions. Then there is a problem, which is there are some elements of the Taliban / Al-Qaeda that have global jihadist ambitions. And how do you find a way of attacking them without creating all these accidental insurgents and guerrillas? Because otherwise, you're in a kind of unending war. So that's to me the kind of central political military problem in South Asia. And then the broader one is, you have a policy toward Afghanistan, you have a policy toward Pakistan, you have a policy toward India. The 3 are totally different. They are not coordinated. The embassies in all 3 countries have totally different approaches to it. CENTCOM's writ, by the way, ends in Pakistan, the Indo-Pak border. So you have 2 different military authorities that are meant to be dealing with it, though I don't think General Petraeus thinks his writ ends at any point on the globe. So it's quite possible that will be something that doesn't really matter. But in point of fact, you have this bizarre situation where, half of it is dealt with PACCOM, the Pacific Command, half by CENTCOM. You have these, as I say, 3 ambassadors. you have to have a coordinated regional policy that tries to reinforce, so that the Afghanistan policy is also being reinforced from the Pakistani side of the border, and the Indian policy is helping. I mean, give you one example of what that would mean. People keep saying, what is the pressure you could possibly put on the Pakistani military, right? We all know the Pakistani military is kind of a central problem here. It's very tough to find because the Pakistani military has played this game of blackmail, saying, if you don't give us money, we're the only thing that functions in this completely failed state, and you're screwed. So we give them the money, $11 billion in the last 7 years. One approach, if it were a regional policy, would be to say, the United States will start coordinating its efforts in Afghanistan in conjunction, in coordination with India. This is Pakistan's greatest nightmare, that the United States and India and Afghanistan become a kind of alliance, and that Pakistan gets frozen out. And that's why the United States has been very careful not to do that, and not to work through the Indians in Afghanistan, because India is becoming the dominant power in Afghanistan. So if we were to be clever, both the carrots and the sticks could be regional, rather than purely, country by country.
I agree with some of that, and I'm not sure I disagree. Well, we'll see. But I agree with the regional approach, absolutely, and I think the Obama administration is going to deal with it regionally. Whether they can get the org chart to map what's actually happening, I don't know. That it may be done through special envoys, but it will be done regionally, and there's an increasing understanding that you cannot approach Afghanistan or Pakistan or India without thinking of the others. So there, I think that's right. One of the other things, well, two other things that are essential to that strategy working. One is to get India to step up, and this actually goes back to the G20, to the UN Security Council, to our relations with India. India is not yet really willing to play the role that its emerging power means it ought to play. So it still enjoys being the head of not the non-aligned movement anymore, but still the developing countries. China does this too, but much less so. And India has, at least the older generation, and Fareed, obviously you know more about Indian politics than I do, but has been unwilling to really play a more responsible role on the global stage, and we need to work hard with the Indians to say, look, you want the recognition in the G20. This is one reason why I think actually the Security Council may change too. This is what you've got to do. So that's one thing we need to do. The second is recognize the economic dimensions of our policy much more, particularly with respect to Pakistan. I mean, we have not used our economic policy, our development policy, as a big part of the strategic policy. We've offered aid to Pakistan, we've offered aid to the military, but we haven't actually been thinking about a sustained economic policy in Pakistan as part of of strengthening the region. I thought it was very interesting that when Pakistan desperately needed money, China did not act. For all the arguments that China is coming up on the world stage, this was a perfect opportunity for China to step in, for China's ally to say, here, we'll bail you out, we've got trillions available. They didn't. It was the U.S. actually that stepped in very quickly, which is very important. Also making clear that we've got to keep the Pakistani economy afloat, and actually we have to develop it. It's hard to believe now, but I think 3 years ago, the Karachi Stock Exchange was the fastest growing stock exchange in Asia, which is really quite remarkable, and there's that dimension. So there, I think, I agree with the regional strategy. I think those are two other dimensions. Where I really think there's going to be a major clash of opinion is on the Taliban. So as a good realist, you can say, look, we needn't inflame this anymore. If we simply pull back, Karzai or whoever's in Karzai's shoes will negotiate with the Taliban, they will reach some kind of accommodation, and then basically what we need to do is create a kind of buffer situation, or else we let it go back to a situation where there's a weak central government and the warlords control the provinces, and as long as they don't host the Al-Qaeda, we're fine. And from a realist point of view, I think that's fine. As an American, as a woman, and simply as a predictor of what Hillary Clinton is going to do, I think there is zero chance we will let the Taliban back into government in Afghanistan. Absolutely zero. Maybe we can isolate the hardline elements of the Taliban and get some more moderate elements who are willing to let women go to school, who are willing to let women do what we've been pushing. But we have spent the last 8 years essentially opening up the doors to half of Afghanistan's population. And the idea that you're going to let people back into government that say, sorry, you are not entitled to an education, you can't go outside unless you have a man with you, you cannot go to the hospital, it's not going to happen.
Well, I mean, I think that this is actually an important issue, but I think it's not as dramatic as you put it. The picture you're painting of Afghanistan honestly bears no resemblance to reality, because Karzai is the mayor of Kabul. We have opened the doors to 50% of the people living in the close proximity of the mayor's office in Kabul. The Taliban rules large parts of Afghanistan. They are ruling large parts of, in the borderlands. The question is really not, are we going to reverse ourselves? The point is really, I guess I'll put it this way: we can spend an enormous amount of time, effort, and energy trying to radically reconstruct Afghan society on our terms and on our clock. Or we can recognize that there are limits to that, and that what we have to really focus on is a kind of counter-sanctuary approach, the kind you described, and provide a lot of assistance for the forces of modernization in Afghanistan, but allow that process to play itself out in a somewhat more organic, local manner. In other words, we cannot win every battle for the anti-Taliban forces for them. There are some of them, particularly political and non-military battles, they're going to have to win. I mean, obviously, I would love for every Afghan person to have all the liberties in the world. But the problem is, the chance that you are going to be able to bring Afghanistan, fast, in a kind of dramatic, accelerated fashion, modernize all of Afghanistan, is unlikely to work. And more importantly, here's the question I don't know, and I would love to hear what Steve's answer to this is. Is it counterproductive to our short-term security goals? In other words, you are destabilizing lots of tribal arrangements, lots of feudal arrangements, lots of social arrangements. When you modernize a country, you are destroying all those lines of authority, all those settled practices. Can you do that and at the same time achieve the degree of security you want, which often means allying with those forces? Petraeus in Iraq decided to do precisely what you are belittling, which was, he said, you know what, I'm going to make peace with the Sunni tribes, and I don't care what they're like, but I want them to stop killing Americans, and I want them to stop killing the government in Baghdad. And I will buy them, I will rent them, and they may be Ba'athist, they may be tribal, they may be feudal, I don't care. And over time, I would argue, it will get modernized, but it will get modernized on Iraq's timetable, not on ours.
But you're caricaturing my position. No, hang on. Okay, because that's a complete caricature of my position. That's not, I mean, of course I don't think we can magically modernize Afghanistan. If we could have, we would have. But in the first place on Iraq, Petraeus made deals with the Sunni tribes who were kicking out al-Qaeda in Iraq precisely because they were way too conservative for the Sunnis. I mean, they were forbidding marriages, they were much more restrained with respect to women. That's not, the issue is not, can we modernize Afghanistan? The issue is, given where we are, and I disagree, I've got a close friend who's lived in Kandahar for the last 8 years, and the Taliban is encroaching for sure, but they don't run Kandahar. We are still able to actually hold on to a lot of places that we've held on to, and Petraeus' strategy is going to be to actually to strengthen the central government and to strengthen and to form a coherent strategy that will bolster at least where we are. All I'm saying is that I think the pure security calculation is let them negotiate with the Taliban and let them create mixed Taliban central governments in various provinces, and it'll be stable. And I'm simply saying, as a matter of domestic politics, I do not think that Petraeus or the Obama administration can agree to that.
They won't be called Taliban, just as the people we're dealing with in Iraq are not being called Ba'athists, though most of them are Ba'athists.
Okay, I want to make sure that there's time for questions, and we haven't touched on terrorism or Russia. So anyone who has a question in that direction, I would welcome. And we haven't really talked much about China. So I'll start with Rita and we'll move.
I'm not going to go to those other questions. I found this debate absolutely fascinating because it cuts to the heart of what people are asking. Will there be a different foreign policy from Clinton as against Jones in the White House? and you are a Clintonian in all of your approach here, and you are a Jonesian, if I can call it that. And I already have heard
what that means either.
and I have already heard that debate unfolding within the Obama camp. So it's going to be very interesting as to how they're going to moderate this. I have two questions here. Fareed, yesterday in the New York Times, Bob Gates was asked, how do you play with both presidents? His answer was extraordinary. He said, well, all the Bush policy is being signed on to by Obama. And the one thing that frightens me is the agreement to send in 20,000 more soldiers to Afghanistan, which will be followed by another request for another 20,000. So where does that take you? Are we going to be having another really big-time war? And where are we going to conduct this war? And what is the outcome of that, which may negate a lot of what you hope for in your comments? To you, I have to say, Anne-Marie, I don't believe one bit, and I've been in this thing for 30 years, you can't just parachute a Mr. or Mrs. America, called Special Envoy, into Palestine, Israel, and well, presto, we have solutions. You don't ever take into consideration the prospect of failure and what happens when you fail, when you're ill-prepared in what you're doing, when you don't take it from the ground up, when you don't have the leadership that can respond. We did that before, and we got the second intifada with all the consequences of it. I would shudder if Obama went down the road of picking a special envoy early on and say, go solve the Palestine-Israeli conflict.
I can answer mine quickly. I'm just making a prediction in terms of what I've seen.
I hope
in
you're
terms
wrong.
of the, and I think there's a very, now whether he'll agree, I don't know, but there's a very strong sentiment that says instead of putting it off to prepare, build on what there is now. And I'm just reporting from, I'm
But
not,
build
I'm
on
reporting,
is something
but that
very-
means appointing an envoy and investing a
Not
lot of time.
necessarily at all.
Let me just say one thing about the Israeli-Palestinian process. I do think you have to keep in mind the fact that the Palestinian community is deeply divided and deeply dysfunctional. And if you can't deliver that piece of it, sort of nothing else matters. And so I would actually first want to try and figure that out before committing a lot of equities and a lot of presidential prestige into it. I don't disagree with the goal at all, but I feel like if you can't solve that problem of the Palestinians, not being able to deliver, in a way, everything else becomes irrelevant. On Afghanistan, I agree with you. If 20,000 more troops without a defined mission is, it's not clear what they're doing. The Brits just announced they were sending 3,000 more troops in. I've asked senior people in the government, do you know what you're doing? What is the mission? Of course we do. They're just responding to an American request. My basic point about Afghanistan is just this. We need a really careful strategic review, which sort of asks this question. To what extent are we provoking a nationalist response in many of these places? To what extent are the Taliban actually in danger of coming into power? To what extent are these people being called the Taliban, or are they disgruntled Pashtun elements who feel they have been excluded and have found this as a garb to come into power? To what extent is Al-Qaeda part of it? I think it's important to remember that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda's relationship was not a particularly happy one, was a quite tenuous one. It's not clear the Taliban knew about 9/11. I'm not saying this in any way to suggest the Taliban are good people. The bigger problem, by the way, we have is that the Taliban has been killing a lot of tribal elders over the last 2 or 3 years. So Petraeus' strategy of reaching out to the tribes might not work. And so we don't have a lot of good options. But I do know that 20,000 more troops, and strengthening the Afghan National Army is a very, very a strategy that seems quite unlikely to work in a highly mountainous terrain with a central government that has never existed in any great strength. Very different conditions from Iraq in that sense. And so I would just be much more comfortable sending 20,000 troops in if it was a little clearer what the actual mission was.
If I could just annotate, I could just annotate that, because there are 3 strategy reviews underway. They'll come together when the president takes office. There's an outgoing interagency that Lute's been overseeing. There's Petraeus's, and Mike Mullen has his own third. So there'll be 3 big strategy reviews. The point will be to, for the first time, write a joint campaign plan for the war. There is no plan now that is agreed upon by all the troops fighting it, which is, and
Throughout
so,
NATO.
And NATO, not even a joint campaign plan that's agreed between the State Department and the Pentagon. Never mind NATO and others. So, and it'll be regionalized. So all of that will happen, and it does have some of the elements you're skeptical about. It'll be directed towards a heavy investment in the Afghan National Army and the police. So the idea that they will go from 60,000 to 300,000 over a short period of time. But the reason for the 20,000 troops is not to fight the war. The reason for the 20,000 troops is to have a successful election next September. There was a strategic question as to whether or not to go forward with the presidential election next fall. And the decision was made to do it because otherwise a government rapidly losing legitimacy would lose that much more. And the only way to set conditions for a successful vote was to send in international troops. So I think that's more or less the answer to that question. Zach?
So there was some talk at the beginning about the chronic issue of the lack of coordination or even intersection between economic policies and national security policies. And that even in the discussion of Afghanistan, that gets, the economic aspect gets somewhat left to the side by inertia, by who focuses on it. You know, you do have this immense problem of the drug trade as being the only viable economic product that Afghanistan offers, which comes up against congressional issues much more than it comes up against necessarily executive branch issues. And there's probably a lot to learn about policy with Colombia as applied to Afghanistan rather than policy toward Pakistan as applied to Afghanistan. But that doesn't easily happen because there's no bureaucratic intersection. And I guess it'd be interesting to hear from both of you, do you even see that happening? I.e., where does the economic dimension enter the table? I mean, with China, it's interesting because it's much more on the table than the traditional national security one. So does the U.S.-China dialogue continue? Does that become a model for other countries? Or are we sort of doomed to the structures we have, which means, you know, some undersecretary of the Treasury will deal with economics, but won't be part of these discussions when it comes to the grand strategy and strategy reviews, because that's not how these things typically get done.
That's not how these things typically get done. You know, that kind of intersection, which I think is important between economics and geopolitics, can only be done by the president or the Secretary of State or the National Security Advisor. They're really the only three people who can do it because, you know, the truth of the matter is these are very disparate spheres. I mean, I've talked to, you know, Larry Summers once about this, and he said, you know, like, it sounds like a good idea. So we're at the National Security Council, and they're discussing targeting mechanisms in the Kosovo campaign. We don't have a lot to add. Treasury doesn't have a point of view as to what should be targeted. You know, and that's one extreme. But there are, of course, many areas like China policy where you do want to integrate. You know, where we have these extraordinary issues with China, and we're trying to get them to be helpful on the global financial crisis. At the very time, we've suspended military-to-military cooperation with them because of an arms sales issue to Taiwan. And those things are happening literally simultaneously, where Hank Paulson is going there begging bowl in hand, saying, can you please bail out our financial system, while we're you know, dissing them on the military side. And those things need to be integrated, but I think it can only happen at the very highest level.
I just say, and part of it is knowing what we're doing. I was at a conversation yesterday where the people who work in pro-democracy work in the U.S. government, have all the funds to support democracy, many of which are going into Afghanistan, knew nothing of what the World Bank was doing to support governance, which is the same thing. It's anti-corruption, it's strengthening institutions, it's rule of law. No notion of what else is going on, either in other institutions or in the government. The plan for this, for the Obama administration, is to have a much stronger State Department and a relatively weaker Defense Department, so that a lot of money and people who might otherwise have been in defense will be in state, and a lot of that is supposed to develop our civilian capacity to match the military capacity. And there's even a proposal to reorganize the State Department so that it would match the military regional command, so you could deploy civilian capacity at the same way to match our military capacity. Whether that would reach all the way to the Treasury, I mean, state has some money, but you know, is it really going to reach to the engines of economic policy? I have my doubts, but I think there will be a more integrated approach, at least within the State Department.
Patsy.
Steve, I just want to pick up on Rita's point regarding the special envoy as sort of a presto bingo parachuting in and imposing an American solution to a problem which is obviously a deeply complex and regional one. I don't see the role of a special envoy as imposing anything. I think a special envoy, let's call it something else. Let's call it a negotiator or even just a diplomat. Something that the Bush administration did not indulge in and had nothing but contempt for. I think the role of a special envoy should be to find common ground, to intensely focus on a region, and to create a solution based on what the problems on the ground, not to impose anything from Washington. And quite frankly, I don't see an alternative to that. If we continue in the present vein of allowing these regions, be it the Middle East or South Asia, to go without this kind of intense American engagement and the treating of these issues as regional issues, I think we're just going to continue, and we'll just have 4 more years of Bush. We'll have the third term of Bush rather than something different. So I don't see a special envoy as imposing policy, but as.
So what's your theory of this of special?
I don't have a theory. I think honestly, a special envoy, it depends on who the special envoy is. You know, I just think that I was speaking specifically about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Well, I just think all I'm saying is, if you don't have the Palestinians, it's a big problem. I don't have an argument against special envoys. I don't have one for. I think that, you know, what one reads in the press is that Ambassador Holbrooke is being considered for South Asia. I think that's actually a very smart idea, because first of all, that is a place where you do need regional coordination. You know, there's something that can't be done by the existing bureaucracy, because it all overlaps in weird ways. I'm not as convinced about that with the Israeli-Palestinian issue.
What choice do we have?
People.
What are the alternatives?
Well, there's an assistant secretary. What I mean is that the
But that's what
existing
we've been doing.
mechanisms. Yeah, but I guess I don't think that creating a special envoy solves the problem or adds creativity. It would depend who it is, and would depend what the charge was. Is there a mission that's achievable? And all I'm saying is, you create a special envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, it doesn't mean you're going to get peace. You know, you may have somebody shuttling around. Tony Blair has been doing this now for 2 years. With as
But
far
with
as
no
I can
support
tell,
from us.
Zero.
Zero.
Yeah, but with zero effect.
Yeah, but we didn't have support.
But Anne-Marie, what would Dennis Ross say if you were about this discussion?
I'd like to be the special envoy. He
But so
wouldn't-
then what is his argument?
No, he
for
wouldn't say that.
role?
And again, what I think that the argument is in. I mean, you made the point about the division between the Palestinians. Absolutely. But do we see that situation getting better or worse? Similarly with the two-state solution, do we think it's getting better or worse? The argument is it's getting worse. There's a moment here in the larger geopolitical configuration where we think that the Saudis can put pressure on the Palestinians, can bolster the Palestinian Authority, that there are things that we can do that have some chance of bringing them together. These are all minuscule chances. But that opportunity is now. It's now because of the geopolitical configuration. It's now because of the new political configuration, because of the elections, and that what we should not do is to pull back. And remember what Bush did when he came in was simply to say,
No, I'm not
absolutely.
arguing for that.
So the purpose of appointing, whether it's an envoy or a special facilitator or however you call it, is to say America is invested. We are invested, and we care. We do think it's worth investing our capital, even if we fail. Right? I mean, the Clinton argument was always, we're going to do it or we're going to die trying, and the claim here is that it was
But
better
Clinton
to try.
did failed, and there were grievous consequences. That's the
But
point.
were they worse than not trying at all?
Grievous. It led to the Intifada II when Camp David failed. You must take into account the potential of failure, not just the potential of success. And you know, we do have ambassadors. We do have standard diplomats. I disagree profoundly with the idea that you don't use normal diplomatic methods and channels. If you talk to our career ambassadors, that's what they would tell you to a person. They resent deeply the idea of envoys coming in and running around and getting a lot of grandstanding without building up the steps. I'm as fearful as you about the Palestine-Israel situation, and I don't think we should fool ourselves into thinking that there is a very quickie solution here. So
I did interpret the Jones appointment, though, as partly an investment in some version of this, because he spent most of the last year working on the Palestinian security forces
Right.
in
limited in
the West Bank, in Jenin,
Yeah.
demonstration project, but the idea was to try to be able to extrapolate it. I had one in the back, and then Richard, I'll come forward. David?
It's an interesting sign of the times when the question about Russia has to come from the floor instead of one of the first questions from the moderator. But hey, what about Russia? Should we go to war over Georgia? Is NATO expansion progressively really a good thing? And kind of a linked question to that is, do you think there's a recognition in the Obama administration that high oil prices is bad for our strategic position? And is some of this apparent conviction to really plow money into alternative energy, is there any foreign policy aspect to that as well?
Well, I'll start by saying I think your first point is a very good one. A lot of the reason we're in the trouble we are with Russia right now is that we have spent the last 10 years talking about foreign policy and not mentioning Russia, and the Russians are really unhappy about it. And we basically wrote them off, and that humiliation that they felt it's not certainly all of what's driving their policy now, but it's a part of it. So I take the first point that we, do think have to start thinking about Russia as one of the key strategic actors again as we talk about foreign policy issues, and that fact itself will have a beneficial effect. More generally, though, I think there's a real divide on what to do about Russia within the Obama administration, much less without. You have a view that says, look, whatever the merits of NATO expansion to Poland, to elsewhere in the Balkans, it was never intended to go right to Russia's borders. With this, we understand they're a great power. They have their zone of interest. We would not take kindly to the Warsaw Pact having included Cuba, which in some ways is the way the Russians see it. And a view that says, let's try to take account of Russia's strategic interests. Let's try to work with them on issues like Iran, on issues, terrorism generally, issues where we have common interests. And another view, and of course, Vice President-elect Biden was very strong in the expansion of NATO and was very strong for Georgia when the Russians invaded. And there was a little disagreement there, and I don't think that tension has been resolved. I have no idea where President-elect Obama comes out, but I think it's one that's going to have to be sorted out because we can't ignore them, and we can't be radically inconsistent as we have been in some ways and could be unless we get a unified policy.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, look, you have to understand with Russia that this is a country that is going through a really severe, is about as close to geopolitical trauma as you can imagine, right? This is a country that in the last 15 years has lost not just the 75-year-old Soviet empire, but the 300-year-old Tsarist empire. I mean, Georgia was incorporated into Russia in 1805. So this is a big shift, a big redrawing of Russia's borders. If you think back to when the British and French lost their empires, it happened with a great deal of convulsions, a lot of pain, a lot of angst. So, this is not happening easily in Russia. It has never happened before. We have been turned into the object of their animosity as a consequence of it. I think part of that is structural. We are the dominant power. They were the collapsing one for the last 15 years. And they are still on a long-term trajectory of decline, I would argue. Despite the rise of oil prices over the last 5 years, they're declining demographically. They have an oil economy that does not produce anything else. They have huge geopolitical problems with the Chinese, prosperous and rising on one side, with a troubled border with Islam on the other side, and a tense border with their former satellites in Europe. If you think about it, that's all of Russia. They have China, Islam, and the Baltics, Poland, Visegrad countries. That said, I think we have mishandled Russia in the sense that we have shown them exactly what Anne-Marie was saying, kind of unnecessary humiliation, unnecessary double standards, rubbing their noses in it where it was not necessary. Little things like we would promise them some small observer status at something, and then we would never come through on it. I had lunch with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, yesterday, and he was talking about these small incidents where, Bush would promise Putin something, and the Russians would get all excited, and it would never come through. And it was something, you can imagine what happened in Washington, some kind of pointless interagency process, with somebody raised an objection meant it never happened. So going forward, I think one of the things we have to do is to try to really streamline that policy and get to the point where we can have a strategic approach toward the Russians, which recognizes that they have sensitivities, they have interests. To the extent we can, we give them those issues that they want. I think that there are 2 or 3 crucial issues that they care about. The first 3 are NATO expansion, NATO expansion, and NATO expansion. And I think the reality is it is going to be very difficult to expand NATO to Georgia and Ukraine, and therefore there's no point making large promises we can't come through on. Georgia has 2 provinces within it that are contested, which means it is not an ideal candidate for NATO membership. This is something NATO has said always. Territorial disputes have to be solved before you become a member. Ukraine is divided about whether it wants to join. So kick this can down the road. You don't need to have this fight now. You can deal with it later and signal to the Russians that this is not going to happen anytime soon. Then you have the missile interceptors, and I think the missile defense shields in Poland, which is a kind of, this is the problem with the system that doesn't work for a threat that has not yet materialized. You're trying to coordinate, an this is the Star Wars defense against the
Iranian missiles.
yet to appear Iranian nuclear missiles. But there's actually a win-win here, which is you say to the Russians, let's cooperate, because the Russians do see Iranian missiles as a problem. And the Putin had actually put forward a couple of proposals of some kind of joint, some collaborative work that the Americans and Russians could do together. Take him up on that to the extent we can, which I gather from my friends in the Pentagon is quite substantial. And there you get a twofer. You get deterrence against Iran, and you also get some cooperation with the Russians. But I think that finally you do have to calmly and in a friendly way make them understand that we respect them as a great power, but that being a great power does not mean they can colonize their neighbors. That is simply a world that has gone away. And it's not us that's going to stop them. Look at who reacted to what happened in Georgia. It was Poland, it was the Czech Republic, it was the Baltic states. Part of what's happened here is the Russians don't realize there has been a rise of everyone else. It's not just the Chinese who are rising. Poland is strong and vibrant. Hungary is strong and vibrant. Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, the Slovak Republic. All these guys are not going to sit around if Russia decides it wants to, replay its 19th century role. There we are just facilitating the desire of these other countries to have some kind of security. I think the Russians will get that eventually, and in any case, even if we didn't do it, those countries are not going to go along. But we could accommodate them on other things.
Any quick comment on the price of energy?
I think yes, by the way, to your question, the Obama administration,
They get that.
I think they get that very, very powerfully. That high oil prices strengthen all the bad regimes in the world. Good oil prices, low oil prices actually produce a certain degree of reform. You see it in Iran most clearly. When oil was $25 a barrel, they elected Khatami, who talked about the clash of civilizations. When oil was $100 a barrel, they elect Ahmadinejad, who says the Holocaust never happened. Maybe if they go back down to 25, they'll discover that the Holocaust did happen.
Richard?
Fareed, you talked about a vision for our foreign policy, which is a stable world order where the U.S. is not at the center of that stability. And I'm just wondering if, thinking about the Middle East, the anecdote you described with the accidental terrorist really resonates with me because we've set ourselves up under the previous administration to say it's either our way or another way, but there's a bipolarity or a duality there that you're suggesting we need to get away from, and I think most of us would agree. I'm not sure if you agree with that, but I think you do. And that multilateral approach should serve as a template, I think, for a lot of the things that we do. So in thinking about the Middle East and where we could achieve some success, because I think that I'd like to hear about the kinds of successes that the administration can achieve relatively quickly in order to establish their credibility, their bona fides, their sincerity in conducting foreign policy. can we take this moment where we've got the moderate Arab countries as perhaps a stabilizing force in the region, and use them in a way to foster a more stable situation, maybe not a peaceful one, but a more stable situation, and energize the move towards stability in the region, and use that as a template for success, perhaps elsewhere.
You know, my impulse would be to move in that direction. That is to say, to try to work on the favorable trends you have between the moderate Arab states and Israel, and to forge some kind of common approaches, reduce tensions between them, rather than go for broke on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. It's really more a reading of the trend lines more than that I care more about one or the other. I just feel like that's more likely to bear fruit right now. So that would be the direction I would go.
And Marie, does that fit with your vision of having attention with the special envoy, or is, I guess Rita suggested, using existing diplomatic channels to explore all the channels in the region as opposed to simply focusing on the immediate, more visible world?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is I don't think you can separate them out. I mean, you can certainly, you can put more or less energy into the Israeli-Palestinian dispute per se, but in terms of accidental terrorists or deliberate terrorists, one of the biggest problems we have, and we know it, is precisely the absence of any resolution and between Israel and Palestine, and the perception that America is completely one-sided, rightly or wrongly, but around the world. So from a security point of view, I mean, Steve said we hadn't talked about counterterrorism, but the counterterrorism guys will be pushing hard to do everything we can to push Israel but in ways that are actually productive, and Palestine and then the Palestinians. It's not just one-sided. So I guess my view is you ought to be working multiple channels. You've got absolutely the Syrian-Israeli negotiations do look like they may be in a different place. If that's a place you could get a win, terrific. We haven't had a win for a very long time, so that would be wonderful, and maybe you start with that. But you put a lot of attention, a lot of energy into working the region on the different parts. What the exact sequence is, I wouldn't presume to dictate, but what I would do is to say, you don't sort of say, well, we're going to work on Iraq and we're going to work on Syria, but we're just going to leave the Israeli-Palestinian conflict until it's in a riper point. I think you've got to work all the different sides, and I do think the result will be some kind of, as I said, it may be an organization that works on water rather than one that is a security pact. But that's an area where everybody has huge common interests, and if you get them working, and also with the EU, I think you've got some more stable anchors in the region.
Which brings you back to the intersection between foreign policy and economic policy.
And all the transnational issues, all the sort of new security issues, absolutely.
We're going to have time for one last question. My eyes failed me at the beginning, and I failed to recognize Bernard Schwartz, who's a very important leader of New America Foundation, a member of our board, along with Kati and Zach. So we're all here in the room together. But Bernard, why don't you ask the last question, and we'll let people get another one.
That we have not addressed here today, and that's the military.
Can't hear you, Bernard.
America for the last 60 years has been the world's military hegemon. We are today, and it is very likely we are going to be for a very undefinable amount of time in the future. You have not addressed how that is a resource for extension of foreign policy, how it integrates and causes tension not only with countries around the world, friend and foe, but also within our own administration. Because usually when you have a military hegemon, somehow, some way it gets to be used. And I don't know how you can develop a playbook for foreign policy without addressing what is America's position toward this resource.
Well, it's a great question. The first thing, as I said, is I think the plan is, we'll see if it works out, for a relatively weaker Pentagon to a stronger State Department. Now, that's still a relatively weaker 800-pound gorilla to a very baby chimp, right? But remember, Gates pushed very hard with Condi Rice to increase funding to the State Department. It didn't happen. But the fact that Gates was on board tells you a lot. And the way in which the State Department is staffing up, the kinds of areas where they want to provide more resources, things like the Office of Reconstruction and Stabilization, creating more provincial reconstruction teams, indicates a shift toward the State Department and a real push to get our diplomatic power to be much more commensurate with our military power. On the military itself, since we're at our last question, I'll just hazard a wild prediction. I think we are going to see the implementation, or an effort at the implementation, of the Rumsfeld agenda toward lighter, smaller forces in this administration rather than the last one. I mean, it got derailed because of the two wars, but actually, if you look at the kinds of military conflicts we are going to be in, the areas where we need to use our military, I don't think we're going to be engaging in many more massive land invasions. So I actually think you're going to see a shift toward different weapon systems and different kinds of forces on the blueprint that probably was already laid out.
Yeah, and I think that this is the biggest long-term shift in American foreign policy making that's taken place over the last 30 or 40 years, which is the militarization of American foreign policy. And you can see it, if you just go to a conference and the Assistant Secretary of State, who is technically the lead American, for the region, is attending, and let's say the CINCPAC, the Commander-in-Chief for Pacific Arms comes. The Assistant Secretary of State will come, by commercial airline, traveling usually coach, traveling 14 hours, with maybe one or two aides, sleepy, bedraggled, and arrive there, get to the conference. The CINCPAC will usually arrive with 3 or 4 of his own planes, with probably 40 or 50 aides, in immaculate condition. It's like, exactly, it's like a proconsul arriving at these places. The disproportion in resources massively affects everything. It's not just that if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, which is something Eisenhower, by the way, said. I mean, Mark Twain said it, but Eisenhower quoted it, which I think is telling. But it's also that even with regard to your strategy, with your policy options, you tend to think in terms that are unnecessarily militarized, that are unnecessary. If you think about this AFRICOM that we've set up a new joint command to deal with the problem of terrorism in Africa. Now you have to ask yourself, speaking of accidental terrorists, does it really make sense to take a part of the world that has gone through a very bad experience with colonialism? Think Rwanda, think the Congo, think Kenya, where some of the most rapacious kinds of colonialism were tried, and therefore the presence of foreign troops, particularly powerful white foreign troops, produces a kind of allergic reaction, and say we're going to solve the problem of terrorism by having an American command structure. Now they say, well, no, but this is going to be a very political military command. That's the perfect example. Our military will be non-military. But isn't there a word for the non-military? It's called the State Department, or it's USAID, or it's, So how do we get to the point where we start using all those other tools and we give them enough weight and enough privilege? It's a very long-term decline. Dean Acheson allowed the construction of Foggy Bottom because he thought it was inconceivable that the Secretary of State needed to have proximity to the President to be the most important foreign policy maker in the administration, because it used to be that the Secretary of State's offices are next door to the White House in the old Executive Office building. And Acheson said it makes no difference where we are geographically. Well, it turns out it makes a huge difference. The National Security Advisor is right next door, and that has drained the Secretary of State's power. The Pentagon has 10 times the resources of state, and that has drained the State Department's power. So, can you achieve some greater sense of I hate to use the word civilian because it sounds kind of pacifist, but I mean really a strategic approach to policy which uses each of these tools as they are effective, rather than one that entirely overweights. The question is one that I think we will have to confront at some point in another context, which is we're going to go through some tough times economically, I believe. I think we're going to go through tough times. We're going to be burdened with enormous debt. And we have a $750 billion military. We're a very rich country. But even for a very rich country, $750 billion is a lot of money to spend without asking yourself, what exactly is this doing? And of course, nobody is allowed to really question the military budget because it's a sign of a lack of patriotism. But it is surely at some point worth asking why we need to spend as much money as the next 45 countries put together on defense.
It could come back to haunt you at a confirmation hearing.
That's an intriguing note. I think everybody here can understand why life for all of us at New America is so enriching with the quality of discourse that these two colleagues have displayed. And I was impressed not just by the obvious depth and cogency and range of it, but also the confidence that you each displayed to disagree in a spirited but entirely civil way. And I think that kind of debate, when surfaced, is enormously clarifying, and I would imagine that the President-elect would benefit from carving out 30 minutes each day to have you come in and put this show on.
His own Brooks and Shields.
That's right, exactly, yes.
We
So,
agree too much for that.
please join me in thanking Anne-Marie and Fareed for taking